Hello and welcome to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Haldane. On this episode, I'm delighted to be speaking to writer and comedian David Baddiel about his latest book, My Family, the Memoir. David.
Yeah.
Where do we begin? Do we
know.
talk about the election? There has been so much going on over the course of the last few days. And as a 90s child, the chance to talk to David Baddiel about the Euros is not one to miss.
Yeah.
But I don't want to neglect the book. And I want to start with Dars itself. That's the name of the restaurant we're at now, the Tandoori Grill. It's well reviewed.
I tend to upfront everything that I do all the time. So I'm going to upfront the fact that I suggested a more expensive restaurant, and it seemed to be, like, from a budget point of view, slightly complex.
Well, Gymkhana, that particular restaurant, was just booked up.
That was
summer.
booked up. But
I would
before
love
that,
to have
I'd
gone.
suggested an incredibly expensive sushi restaurant because I was taking the piss, basically. But then I thought, what am I doing?
Yeah.
I had a moment of clarity and thought, I like Dars. It's not expensive, and it's very near me, and I do really like it.
Have you been coming here for long?
Yeah, well, I've lived around here for a long time. There are a few restaurants. So on Fleet Road, which is over there, there's two other curry places, and there's this one. And I think this is the best one, and the most that's like a sort of Bengali, Pakistani canteen. And I like that about it. And also, the manager who just came up to us, he, I think, also owns the news agent over there, and possibly another shop in this area. So I feel like they are essentially the mafia around here, and I need to stay with them. Yeah.
Taking care of everyone.
Yeah. I brought Giles Corran here once because I thought, I know Giles Corran, and I thought, well, it's not the sort of place he normally goes, but it's brilliant. And he didn't really like it. And as a result, he didn't review it. He thought, well, it's too small a place for me to do a hatchet job. But I always thought, he's just wrong. And then Faye Mashler, who is a much more senior restaurant critic, did a really good review of it. So I think I was right.
You've got a new book out, a new memoir
Yeah, but do you want to
entitled
talk
My
about
Family.
the Euros and about...
We can talk about that, I'm sure, in time. What's there to say about it now? We've got a new game versus the Netherlands coming up on Wednesday.
It's very difficult to talk about it. If anything I say now will seem either stupid if it's optimistic or pessimistic if we've won. I mean, what I think is that I'm excited at this stage. I did the Today programme the other day, and this might just be because he's a professional or was a professional, but I was doing it with Graham Lasso, who I like very much. But their first question was, it was before the Switzerland game, were you excited? And Graham, well, not really. I'm more intrigued than excited. And I thought, of course I'm excited that England are in a quarter-final. It's always exciting. I am not a fan. I'm not an instinctive fan of Gareth Southgate. I think he is a man saddled by anxiety. I think that comes from him missing that penalty in '96.
Really?
Yeah. And also just naturally being a defensive, he's a defender. He's a very decent, slightly cautious, gentle man. I think for England to win something, he has to at some point play a different game than he never quite has.
Okay. If you could take any member of the team from '96 to be manager instead.
To be manager?
Yeah. To be their manager instead of Southgate with their attributes that you think England could do with and maybe could have done with this entire tournament. Which player of that team would it be?
Well, that's a very good question. And actually none of that team, as far as I'm aware, have gone on to be successful managers. So the obvious person is Alan Shearer, partly because Kane is not playing very well. He scored twice, but he's not playing very well. And, in fact, the whole country has listened to Alan Shearer saying this is what Kane should be doing. And to be fair to Alan Shearer, he's got license to say that, because he's done it. As a manager, he was terrible. He was terrible at Newcastle and didn't really work out for him. And so that's an interesting thing, is great players often don't make great managers. Mourinho wasn't even a player, and Guardiola wasn't a great player, etc., etc. So that's hard to know, really. Just for comedy reasons, in a way, the player I would most like to be in charge of England, even though he's gone a very odd route mentally right now, and he wasn't in the squad for Euro 96, but he was available for Euro 96, would be Matthew Le Tissier. I actually went up to Terry Venables. I was obsessed with Matthew Le Tissier as the sort of maverick route to success, the sort of Ibrahimovic route to success for England in the 90s. I just thought he was such an extraordinarily brilliant player, but so obviously not the sort of player who normally plays for England. And I thought Venables might change that. And I actually spoke to him at some football do I was invited to right at the start and said, please pick Matthew Le Tissier. And he said, that's the thing about football, we've all got our own opinions, haven't we? Which was basically a way of telling me to fuck off. And then he picked him, I think, 7 times. It's a good question.
Do you harbour secret dreams of being able to hear that song when football has come home, to have that song fulfil its promise?
There's an odd thing about that song, in that, the thing that is said to me most often is, David, is it coming home? Which has now become code just for are England going to win a major tournament. And actually, the song was always a very specific emotional arc, and an unusual one at the time, although it then became copied in various ways, because all other songs, football songs, people forget this, that there always was a different football England song at every tournament, and they had normally very simple lyrics, meaning we're going to win. There was a song called This Time More Than Any Other Time, or Back Home, which was about bringing the trophy back home. Did include the word home, of course. But none of them showed any weakness or vulnerability. And, of course, Three Lions begins with commentators saying that England aren't very good, and then the song actually goes, England are going to throw it away, they're going to blow it away. But then it changes and becomes, but I know they can play because I remember. And then the chorus, points to these fragments of our ruins where we remember certain tiny moments where England have done well and played well, and that's how we magically, in a kind of magical thinking way, think that this time England won't fuck it up. And so to answer your question, I'm not sure the song straightforwardly predicts that England are going to win. I think the song is more about chiming with the magical realism of football fans who are mainly in despair, but sort of cling to this magic hope that things will be different this time.
It's still such a moving song.
I know, that's what's moving about it,
yes,
in my opinion.
But even though the message is evergreen, the sound of it too has aged really well, I think.
Ian's an amazing songwriter. I mean, he wrote the music first, but I think even without that music, we were always going to write a song that was about the emotional journey that England fans have gone on. It just so happened that Ian Brodie then wrote a very, very moving melody to go with it. That is a poignant melody, although it moves from sadness to sort of hope. That's what it does.
In a brilliant way, a brilliant trajectory.
Way, an absolutely brilliant way. It's the musically brilliant song. So I very much would like to see England fulfil that, if that hope is magical or whatever, at some point. I think that some people sometimes say to me, oh, but if that happens, then you'll have to retire the song. And I think, why is that? Because in my sense of, football chants, Man City, don't stop singing, we're the greatest team the world has ever seen, or whatever, they don't stop singing that when they've won the Champions League. They sing it again next season.
It can be outdated for a period, but then, of course, it has to come back as a sort of it's a mantra, isn't it? It's a way of bringing people together.
I mean, as we speak, I am fairly convinced, in fact, I know, that the FA are sort of trying to phase it out for Sweet Caroline. Are you kidding? Oh, no, definitely that's happening. Definitely. I've spoken to whoever it is at the head of the FA. I happened to meet him at a football
I want to flip this table.
And I said, why don't you play Three Lions at the end of end of England games anymore? And he said, well, he sort of vaguely talked about it's a new era and the fans like Sweet Caroline, and
that's bollocks, because they play it at boxing matches as well. It's just a bland vanilla.
Yes, I know that's
soundtrack.
Bollocks, Jack. Yeah, that's the problem. The problem with Sweet Caroline is, I think, this is not a football song. This is a corporate arena song that anyone will join in with if it's played, because it's a banger. So they'll join in, but it doesn't mean anything.
Just have the McDonald's jingle.
Yeah, you could have almost anything, and people will join in with it.
Unbelievable.
It's not a song with any emotional, veracity or any emotional intensity for football fans. But they don't. He said to me, no, what we're going to do is we're going to play Sweet Caroline at the end of England games, and then we'll play Three Lions, which I don't know if they even bother with anymore. But there was a sense. There was a sort of weird political problem with Three Lions. They've always been weird about it at the FA. And then there was this weird political problem whereby in 2018, Luka Modric said after Croatia beat us in the semi-final, he said that one of the reasons why Croatia wanted to beat us is they thought the It's Coming Home song was arrogant. And this led to this notion, this incorrect notion, that football's coming home is a sort of nationalist statement about England owning football because it's the home of football.
Well, football would come back and we'd put it in the British Museum.
I mean, you know, we are the country, as far as I know, that codified football as a game first of all. You know, so it has a claim to be the home of football. But two things: A, it's a vulnerable song; it's not a triumphalist song. And B, since when did football chants have to be, you know, politically correct, for want of a better word? You know, there's no. It's just a magical song about hope. You know. But the FA's always been weird. They've always been weird about it, is the truth. So there we are.
Okay, breathe. The book on my right, My Family, the Memoir, by you, David, published just last week, is, by all accounts, all reviews I've read, and the word that keeps coming up, honest. I noticed that you have this penchant, whatever you want to call it, for saying something and then clarifying.
Yeah.
Sometimes outright disclaimers, sometimes just going back and reassuring the reader that what you mean by something is X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Why is this important to bring up? I suppose because, again, it goes back to the thing that you even say in the book, but you've said around it too, which is that you find it really difficult not to tell the whole truth all of the time.
Yeah.
And I think in many respects, to write a memoir with that attitude was always going to produce this very raw and complete account of people and events. But perhaps we could just start with that psychological position from which you wrote the book.
Well, the word honest does come up a lot. I like the word hilarious coming up more, which I think comes up more often. I mean, just funny. People are telling me it's the funniest book they've ever read, and funny is incredibly important to me in all walks of life, but in a way particularly in this book because, you know, I say very early on, it's not a misery memoir, and it is a story of dysfunctional upbringing and a dysfunctional family, and what it's done to me to be in that. But it's a sort of celebration of that, and therefore very different from, say, Spare by Prince Harry, which is an angry book about being in a dysfunctional family and someone who's so uncomfortable in their own skin that they cannot celebrate whatever the dysfunction has done to them.
I have to admit, I haven't read Spare, but you clearly have.
I've read Spare,
and did Spare spur you on to write this in some way?
No, I think I was already writing it when I was, in fact, listening to Spare.
Okay, interesting.
Which is read by Prince Harry.
Right.
And I think you can hear the rage in his voice in the audiobook. And the key element, you know, one of the key elements of this book is I use the phrase, at one point I say I don't even think of the damage done to me by my parents as damage. I think of it as accidental sculpture. Because I'm very happy with who I am, and who I am involves damage, and it involves transgressions that happened in my childhood, but it's got me to a place of, say, overarching honesty, slightly on the spectrum almost honesty, which I like. I like that I've got that, and I probably wouldn't have that without the transgressive, odd boundary crossing parent. And I think you need a certain amount of, well, you certainly, anger and judgment are the things that will stop you having that sort of understanding about yourself.
That's a lovely phrase, accidental sculpture. I think a lot of parents can relate to that.
I hope so. Someone asked me today, I think, whether I was less forgiving before I was in therapy, and I said, no, not really. Although I was very happy, I was glad that I went into therapy. I never quite took therapy seriously, and I never took it quite seriously because you have to be specific as to what happened to you when you're talking about your early life, and what happened to me involves the words golf memorabilia. And once you've got golf memorabilia in the room, it's almost impossible to take anything seriously, and that's a blessing. It's a blessing, because once you are laughing at the stuff that's happened to you, you're sort of forgiving it.
I want to get on to the golf memorabilia
in a
moment.
I'll talk about that in a minute, but just in terms of your thing about the truth, one thing I am very pleased about as a writer is, you're right, I have a tendency to mix it up, to sort of say, I'm saying this, but actually here's another way of looking at it, here's a footnote about it, and maybe I'll just completely contradict that later on in the book or whatever. And that's because I think the truth is always complex, and the truth of personality is perhaps the most complex of all. But what would worry me as a writer is that therefore the book becomes a slog and becomes like there's too many caveats and there's too many times where I go back on something or whatever, and no one has said that. No, apparently it's a really accessible, fluid read, which is I'm very happy about, because I think in the writing it might not have felt like that. In the writing I felt this constant need to sort of, as I say, mix it up and not tell a simple truth at any point.
I suppose you can get away with doing that because there is a solid story underneath. It's really a book about your mother, isn't it?
Well, I think it's interesting that my mum is definitely the star of the book. And it's very interesting that, actually, because when I did a show, I did a one-man show using some of the same material, also called My Family. It was My Family, not the sitcom, rather than My Family, the memoir. And although I felt my mum was the star of that show, a lot of people came away thinking my dad was the star of that show. I think because at that point, people, it may just have been the zeitgeist, were very energized by the fact that I was talking about his dementia. And he was still alive then, and I was fine. I would never have had any issues, really, with going on stage and talking about the fact that I had a father with dementia, and that there was comedy in that as well as tragedy. And people, therefore, seemed to highlight that in their memory of that. But even then, I thought, that's a thing, and it's hopefully interesting and moving and funny, whatever. But the thing that's amazing is my mother's story. And the thing that's also amazing, and some people did see this, is that my instinctive lack of judgmentalism, whatever the word is, means that I, as the son of an unfaithful woman, I'm totally happy to celebrate my mother's infidelity because it was so funny. That's my way into thinking about it. And it's interesting that even now that we do not live in the Middle Ages, people seem to be quite surprised by that. People seem to think that being very open about, and, as I say, somewhat celebrating the fact that my mother had an affair, that theoretically, although I'm sure I am, but theoretically I may not be my father's son, all that kind of stuff. For me, that's just rich and strange and funny, and none of it is a cause of shame. I don't really recognise shame as an emotion. So anyway, yes, the key story in the book is, and I begin by talking about her funeral and about how people at her funeral were continually telling me, as people do at funerals, that my mother was wonderful. And after a while it began to irritate me because I felt that this is just erasing her a second time after death, that the lack of specificity, the lack of idiosyncrasy in the bland idealisation of the dead is just a way of flattening them out and they become more forgotten. Here we are at her memorial and we're forgetting her because we're not talking about one of the key things about her, which is that she had an affair with a golfing memorabilia collector in midlife and didn't just have an affair, she then became obsessed with golfing memorabilia, turned our lives and her life over to golf, a sport that none of us were interested in, and became someone who was a total golf memorabilia obsessive and also quite a successful person in the world of golfing memorabilia, whilst all the time everyone kind of knew that this was part of this sort of weird sub-erotic landscape where it was all about this guy. And also, because she was my mum, she did it in a very bizarre way, such as, for example, he ran a business called Golfiana. She, when she became obsessed with golfing memorabilia, just also ran a business called Golfiana, and that was supposed to be a way of showing this bloke that she loved him.
It reminded me of Curb Your Enthusiasm, you know, when Larry opens the Spite store.
Yes, it is a bit like that.
But it's with the same name. I don't even know if that's legal, is it?
To
open a competitor with the same name.
I always thought it clearly is against some kind of copyright corporate law that she's done that, but I don't think David White, who was her lover, kind of had the wherewithal to do. It was clearly just a tidal wave of sort of golf-inspired. I don't know how far you've got, but in the book I use this, I think, quite good analogy, which is species drift. Because some people have said to me, so did your mum actually like golf? And she never played golf, by the way. But everything she wore was like golfy. She wore like earrings, and she wore like a club on the end of a necklace, and she would have golfing cards, and everywhere was golf. And I said, well, it was like species drift insofar as dinosaurs evolved feathers for thermal insulation. But gradually, over time, that led to flight, and dinosaurs are therefore directed to birds, and that was kind of an accident. Similarly with my mum, I think she decided to become obsessed with golf to show this bloke who she was in love with, oh, I like what you like. But a few years later, she's a fucking golfing memorabilia queen. She's running a business. She's turned everyone's lives over to golf. And I think he's thinking, you're just pushing me out of my market. And it's not at all what I want. Yeah, but she's forgotten that because it's gone another way for my mother because she's so obsessive. And so the book is partly about that, but it's also not just like, wasn't this bizarre? I'm trying to understand it. And one of the ways I try and understand it is my mother was a refugee from Nazism. She was born in a place called Königsberg in 1939, only just got out of Germany. Her parents, which she would have known this, even though she wouldn't have experienced it, had been very rich before the Nazis took everything away. And so my mother had, I think, in her mind, a parallel life in which she would have been, you know, a wealthy woman, a society woman who would have married like a Prussian prince. Her life would have been very glamorous.
And so was David White.
I think David White's the nearest she could get. In Cricklewood in 1974.
It's fascinating.
Was this sort of smooth, clubbable, pipe-smoking golf guy. And by the way, I mean, this might be reaching a bit, don't forget that golf clubs were mainly restricted to Jews still in the 1970s.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Just racism.
Golf club.
Golf clubs in general were not available to Jews. Not always straightforwardly written down in their constitution. It was just a known thing.
It sounds like an arbitrary thing to restrict until you think about golf and even now what it means.
Well, there's a famous Woody Allen story. It's interesting, actually. So Woody Allen tells the story, I mean, many times. It's his moose story. Do you know that story?
I do. I'm a huge Woody Allen fan.
Okay, so the end of the moose story, I don't know if your audience may not know it, and I can't do the whole thing, but in a very... I'm ruining it now, but basically he shoots a moose and he straps it to his car, and then it turns out it's not a moose. It's basically, he ends up with people in a moose costume who are two Jews in a moose costume who are on the way to a fancy dress party, and they get shot at the end of the story, and their head is in a golf club. And then he says, and the joke is on them, the golf club, because it's restricted. By which he means it's not open to Jews. And actually, when he did the same joke in a British performance, which he says, he doesn't say restricted, he says it's not, then they don't let Jews in. So clearly he was worried that the word restricted may not be known.
I have the audio of that set. It's a brilliant set.
Wow.
I love the last joke where he says, I don't know how to sum this up. He goes, I need to leave it on a positive note. Perhaps if I take two negatives. David White is the only name from the book that has come up so far. Just for the benefit of listeners, your mother, named Sarah, originally from it.
Yeah, she was. From it was a name that was forced on her by the Nazis.
That's right, of the very limited number of names that Jews could be named.
Yeah.
And, of course, your father, Colin.
Colin, yeah.
We'll come back to all of these characters and how they interact after we've paused to eat this delicious...
Okay, can I just say what we've got?
Yeah, please.
So, we've got this thing that I haven't had before because I thought it took ages to order. And it's a lamb karai, I think. It's in a bigger pan than just the little dishes. And I think this is basically just a very nice-looking lamb curry. I thought it would be a bit more like a half leg of lamb, but it's not that. And then there's also... What's this? Is this chicken on the bone? Yeah, this is chicken on the bone.
Chicken on the bone. We have some saag paneer, some naan, and some pillow rice.
Eating because I can't have food in front of me for this long without eating.
So in front of me is an absolute massacre. How did you find it this time, David?
It was really great. I'm very glad that we had the lamb because even though it was not, I thought we'd get a curried leg of lamb. We didn't, but it was really nice. I liked all of it. I was worried that I ate about 40% more than you did, but
I wouldn't worry. I had a big lunch.
Okay, all right. But it was great.
You said in the first part of our conversation that you have found it easier to forgive, to understand, to be curious rather than judgmental about your mother's affair because it was so funny. If it were any less funny, would you find it harder? Or are you always looking for the funny in order to find forgiveness?
That's a very good question. I think the funny is key to why I want to write about it and how I can find a way into celebrating it. I think it's hard for me to separate that completely from what I'm going to say next. which is that, in general, I think that judgment and the rush to judgment, which is something that happens more and more in our world, to classify something as good or bad or good or evil or whatever, is a way of blocking understanding. That if you want to understand something, then what you need to do is not say that, because it's the end. That's a full stop, right? If you say that as a bad person, that's a full stop. If, however, you say, okay, that person did that stuff, and maybe they did it because of this, and maybe what they were hoping for was that, and it went wrong, then it's much more interesting, much more curious about life, but you have to avoid judgment to get there. You know, you can still occasionally reserve judgment. You can still say, and I do occasionally in the book, okay, this was probably really quite bad, this thing that happened, but most of the time, I'm not interested in that, because it is a full stop. I mean, one of the things I talk about in another thing that I've done, I did a show about trolls, about social media trolls, and I talked about how my process with trolls tends to treat them like hecklers, and my process with hecklers is not to get angry with them, but to treat them like sort of fellow improvisers. So with an improvisation, what you technically should do is say yes. If someone says to you, you know, hello, Mr. Dentist, you don't say, what are you talking about? You say, yes, just lie back and open your mouth, right?
Is this the yes and technique?
Yes and, yeah.
Nice.
And my technique with hecklers was the same. It was sort of yes and, but to sort of subtly bring them down whilst doing that. And I would say that yes and rules my life to some extent. That I think my sense is that with this information about my parents, some of which I didn't know before I started writing the book, because there was a treasure trove of sort of letters and photos and stuff I hadn't seen before, even though none of it surprised me. It just intensely confirmed my sense of particularly who my mother was. But my process is to say, where does this lead? Where does this lead into my estimation of her and my father and my early life and truth and all the rest of it? And the minute you say it was bad, I don't think any of that follows. You just, that stops that. So, to answer your question, I don't think it's just the funny. I think my interest is in understanding and not in judgment in general. But funny really helps, because the more funny it is, the more I want to keep going.
Tell us more about your mother. I mean, we've yet to really talk about her, the sort of person that she was, how David Whyte came into your lives.
Actually, I don't quite know when David Whyte came into our lives. I don't remember. The book actually begins with a sort of impressionistic sketch of him trying to teach me how to do a golf swing when I'm about 11 or 12 or something. I might have been a bit younger, I can't remember. And we're in our back garden, and it's quite transgressive. Not for any sexual reason, but because we have a goal in our back garden. We have an old toy football goal that I spend most of my time playing football in and with my dad and blah, blah, blah. And so it's weirdly transgressive that this strange man is trying to teach me how to play golf. And in my mind, I hit it quite well. In fact, I hit it over the net of the football goal, if you want a symbol of how this man was changing the boundaries of our landscape. But my mum was... I think that one of the most fascinating things for me about my mum is that I think that we have a sort of rather nursery slopes idea of how personality is formed, which is sort of sub-Freudian, which tends to be about how you repeat the patterns that your parents set out. I think it's much more complicated than that, and you're much more likely to imbibe something and push back against other things. And one thing I've imbibed, I think, from my mother is a sort of shamelessness. So my mother was always, one of the things in terms of you asking about her is that people said, oh, how can you write about your mother's affair? My mother was intensely proud of her affair. She felt it was, in a very 70s way, that it was a very glamorous thing to have an affair.
Intensely proud about almost everything, right?
She was proud about everything about herself, but she was definitely very proud of the affair.
Sure, but importantly, it's worth mentioning, as I was flicking through this book, still reading it, but able to look at pictures, the picture of her wearing the bagels around her neck.
Yeah.
A great symbol of her fearlessness, really.
I mean, I don't know if my mother would have thought about it in that way. I don't think she'd have thought, oh, there's all this anti-Semitism, but I'm going to wear a bagel necklace anyway. I think she just liked the bagel necklace, and it wouldn't have occurred to her to be worried about it, even though she was a refugee from Nazism, right? And I've spoken to many Holocaust survivors, and certainly children of Holocaust survivors, who are deeply in the closet about their Jewishness. Well, my mum wasn't in the closet about anything about herself. although, having said that, I don't think my mother was a beacon of truth either, and that's the way that I push back against my mum, because I think that she was someone who lived her life through adopting many different personas, and one of them was golfing memorabilia nut, right? And it was a weird persona, and it was to do with this guy, but it was definitely a persona, because I don't really believe that my mother actually liked golf. I don't think she knew that. I think she gaslit herself on that thing, which I think a lot of people do when they create personas for themselves. And also my mother, she didn't really know how to relate to people, but she thought, I'm going to tune into what they like. So she gaslit me with that, which I don't know if you've got this far in the book, but there's a point in time where I talk about Billy Bunter books. And Billy Bunter books were books written for children, in fact, in the 20s and 30s. So I was too young for them. But my mum had loads of these Billy Bunter books from when she was a children's book dealer, foisted them on me when I was a kid, and because I just thought I should do what my mum likes, I should go with her, I then said, oh yes, I love these, and the next thing I knew, she'd enrolled me in something called the Old Boys Book Club, which was a society of people who liked Billy Bunter, and they were all 70 and I was 11. And she would drive me to people's houses and leave me with all these 70-year-olds while they talked about fucking Billy Bunter for 3 hours, and then come and pick me up. And at no point did I say, actually, I'm not sure I like Billy Bunter, because I went along with it, right? And so I think all of that, and seeing my mum being like that, in terms of me saying I push back, is that my intense, slightly mental need for authenticity is more to do with that than a sort of straightforward idea of lying. It's more to do with I desperately all the time want to be myself. Like, I can't bear not being myself. And I think that's because I saw my mum never quite knowing who she was and chasing this version of herself in many different mad ways.
She used imitation as the greatest form of flattery in order to, in some sense, be closer to somebody that she was attracted to in David White.
Yes, but that thing is, I can't stress it enough. I do talk about in the book, this notion of how she would connect to people with a notion of what they liked is very important. Like, even later in life, like, my wife doesn't particularly like champagne, but I think once she said that she liked champagne, and my mum would always then buy her, often very, very cheap champagne, because my mum was not very profligate with stuff that she bought, but she thought that's what she likes. I'll buy it for her. I once, when I was a kid, talked about, because I'd seen a film of her liking Marilyn Monroe, and my mum bought me lots of pictures. It was sort of weird, again, of Marilyn Monroe that I sort of ended up putting up on my wall, and still, like, just before she died, she'd be sending me first day covers with Marilyn Monroe on them. And so if you relate that to the golfing guy, if you turbocharge that with the golfing guy, is how he likes golf, I have to become the biggest fan of golf ever, and so he'll like me more.
What you described earlier is actually, to my mind, a sign of great emotional intelligence, when a person can really listen to others and pick out the things that matter to them, and then remember that and be able to reproduce it in some way.
But she always got it wrong. But she always got it wrong.
But with the Marilyn Monroe photos, for example, she'd heard that you liked her, and maybe she overshot by bringing you loads of photos of Marilyn Monroe. But in ordinary circles, like people 13. Appreciate that, don't they?
I was 13.
You remembered.
I was 13 in 1978 or whatever it was. Right, she had died in 1964. Marilyn Monroe, this is right. She's still obviously a very attractive woman. It's kind of weird though as well, because it's obviously about my burgeoning sexuality that I like Marilyn Monroe. So it's a bit odd that my mother, who was very,
yes, I see what you're saying.
Was kind of boundary crossing about talking about her own sexuality the whole fucking time. But I can't remember, you see, that's the thing. That's lost in the mist of time, is the moment when I said to my mum, presumably they had a rerun of Some Like It Hot on the telly. Presumably I'd said, she's a very pretty woman about it. And next thing I know, there's like 50 black and white photos of Marilyn Monroe that my mum has put up on my wall. All right, and as I say, still sending me pictures of her. It's mad, right? It's mad. But it's the way that my mum, who I think relating to people in a normal way was something that she didn't really know how to do.
Well, I think certainly in terms of the golfing memorabilia store, the Spite store, although we can't really call it a Spite store, it was a store of adoration, wasn't it?
Adoration.
That takes it to a whole new level. I mean, could you unpack for us just the story behind that, the moment that your house became a golfing emporium?
It's very interesting in terms of it being a book about memory. I can't remember a moment when that happened. It seemed to happen very quickly. In my mind, it seems to happen very quickly. In my mind, there is no golf. No one talks about golf. Golf is absolutely not a sport we ever watch. We are obsessed with football.
There will be golf.
And then there is golf everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. And that seems to happen overnight. It doesn't, but probably only about a year or so. My mum used to collect and sell children's books. and she had a little business doing that called Little Folk, and she always had cards and catalogues, and then suddenly all those cards and catalogues become about golf, right? And golfing memorabilia, and there's golfing memorabilia absolutely everywhere. And of course, one of the things which is key in the book is that it was really obvious what's happening, including obvious to her children, including the fact that she was basically telling all her children. But my dad somehow manages not to notice it. And I always use that construction. I use it in the book, and I use it when people ask me, because people say, oh, was he in denial? And I say, not in a simple way, because in denial, I think, implies this cuck, to use better, I'll use a modern word. Obviously, a modern word derived from the word cuckold, which is what we're talking about. It implies someone who kind of couldn't handle it, and so was all sort of like nervously not thinking about it. But my dad was a man for whom aggravation was probably his key thing. It's like everything for my dad was aggravation. I think I describe him in the book as a man who liked food, football, and shouting, who the fucking hell is this now, every time the phone rang. And he was constantly annoyed and irritated and aggravated, principally by my mother. And so when my mother started becoming incredibly interested in golf, it was like another type of just aggravation. Sort of like, what the fuck's she doing now? I can't fucking be bothered with that. Golf, whatever. It's just another one of her random madnesses. And I think it was more that. It was more that than sort of like, oh my God, she's having an affair and I can't deal with it, so I'm going to pretend it isn't happening. It was much less beta than that. It was much more, oh, fuck off. And sort of, yeah, he just didn't engage with all the various sort of madnesses that she was using to try and crank her life into this glamorous place. Because he was the opposite. He was a Welsh working class bloke, very clever, interested in science, but emotionally completely like not bothered with anything like that. Utterly unromantic. I mean,
I'm failing to remember the name of this movie. Have you seen Steven Spielberg's autobiographical
The Fleischmans.
film? That's right.
Is it The Fleischmans?
Yeah.
I have.
Did you relate to that?
A bit. I mean, I remember when it came out, a few people saying to me, oh, this will be a bit like your story because the mum's having an affair and the dad is kind of going along with it. But I'll be honest with you, although I quite like that film in its way, I like the characterisation of the mum, actually. And it has some similarity in that I think there's a forgiveness in it. It was beyond that, fairly ordinary, I thought, in its portrayal of a family.
Interestingly, you cite a website in the book, ways to tell if your partner's having an affair, and one of them is that if she shows a particular interest
in something that they've never shown any interest in
yes,
before,
that's right,
such as golfing. And they happen to just use golfing, beware, it says, beware. So that information, obviously my dad never read that website, but it's sort of aimed at, say, a spouse who thinks their partner might be cheating. But what I say is, it's more like my mum used it as an instruction. It's like, don't just be interested in it, be absolutely obsessed with it.
Yeah.
And they'll love that, and that's wrong. Having said that, David White, who, by the way, only died about a month ago, I found this out from his half-sister, who came and saw the show in the West End a number of times and wrote to me to tell me. Yeah, I was quite sad about it.
Did you have a good relationship with him?
No, I didn't know him, really. I mean, he was around a lot, came to my bar mitzvah and all sorts of things, but no, I only really know him as refracted through the weird, golfy, erotic lens of my mother's passions. But no, in general, I was sad, really just because... Yeah, I mean, it's actually an interesting thing, because, like, when this book was written, HarperCollins, who published it, and me, had a Zoom with a lawyer. And the lawyer said, okay, so I don't think David White can sue for libel because everything you're saying is true and there's lots of documents. The book's got loads of pictures sort of bearing it out, but he could possibly sue for intrusion of privacy. And then she said this brilliant thing. She said, unfortunately, the book is so funny that I don't think anyone would take it seriously, his attempt to sue you. It's just too funny, and when you read it, you laugh, and then no one will take it seriously. And on that advice, they didn't cut anything. Literally cut nothing.
Wow.
But I could tell there was still a slight nervousness going on.
Yeah.
And so then when I was told he was dead, there should have been a relief. But actually, I was just sad, because this tragicomic drama is what the book is about and is a very, big chapter of my early life, and now all the main players have exited the stage, and that felt a little sad to me.
It's such an extraordinary situation for a young boy to find himself in, for any child to find themselves in. Would you say that the story of your mother, David White, and your father was the making of you as a comedian?
I think it was certainly a very important building block. and the point in time, which is probably quite early, when I was just sort of 16 or 17, I think, where I was already finding it funny. I was already thinking this is funny. And so the fact that I was able to sort of be in that situation, which, as you say, is kind of transgressive and mad and dysfunctional and maybe could have caused some damage, but I'm using comedy very early on to narrate it to myself, and that's salvational for me, right? I think that's important. I think as I grew older, I think there are many things about my parents and how they were that formed who I am. I think my dad is really important in general, because my dad's, I think I am, I mean, this is banal, but I think I am something of a combination of my mum's shamelessness, her sentimentality. I'm quite sentimental. My dad's completely unsentimental and sort of quite romantic at some level, but at the same time I have a muscularity, particularly about comedy. I swear a lot. I find swearing very funny. I like comedy that is really lands quite heavily and to some extent with a punch, and that's totally my dad. And so those two things, which, if you were Jordan Peterson, you would say is a male and female, pole. They both exist in me, I would say, and so I am a combination of them both.
Have you ever read a memoir anything like your own? You feel it comes even close to the same degree of honesty and total desire to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I haven't read that many memoirs. I've read Experience by Martin Amis, and that's funny, and about his dad, and honest. So without wishing to tie things up in too neat a bow, or indeed to compare myself to Martin Amis, I would say it's possibly got some relationship to something like that. Although I would say a big difference between Experience and this book is, Martin's dad was Kingsley Amis, and so he came from a world that was already literary, or already, to my mind, quite glamorous, quite sort of glamorously sleazy, literary, all the rest of it. And one thing I need to make very clear, and I start off talking about this, is that my world that I actually grew up in was only made strange and made rich and strange, in my opinion, by my parents' transgressiveness, particularly my mother's, because the mise en scene of Dollis Hill in 1973 was entirely mundane. I mean, rigorously, grimly mundane. Fame and glamour and anything like that was a million miles away. It sort of still amazes me at some level that I have become in any way famous or whatever, because it felt like most people I know, not everyone, not Frank Skinner who lives in my road, but a lot of the people I know who are in my business, there's something, it turns out, in their early life, some thread through which they could pull themselves into that world. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. It was so lower middle class, sort of Jewish, dull thing. And then my mum, and this is what is great about it, made it weird, right? And once it becomes weird, there's something exciting about it, right?
Yeah.
But I can't think. I mean, I have read some memoirs. I read House of Glass by Hadley Freeman, who is one of the people who says this is the funniest book I've ever read.
Yes, I see. That's right.
House of Glass is very good, but it doesn't have that kind of comedy in it, no.
We've already discussed how open your mother was, how shameless, fearless, to put it another way, she was. Well, she was open about your burgeoning sexuality as a young boy, but she was also open about her own.
Yeah, all the time.
And you found a collection of her erotic poems, I think, was it called? What was it, the title? Feelings?
Feelings is the title, yeah. And, I mean, I found that after she died, and that is a good example of, I quote, I think, Nora Ephron saying that everything is copy, and I think it's someone else, I'm going to say Evelyn Waugh, but maybe it's who said that there's a sort of sliver of ice in the writer's heart. Is it Evelyn Waugh? By which whoever wrote that means that there's a writer will always think, I can use this, however difficult it is. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe for a second I thought, oh, bloody hell, and then I thought, material, this is incredible.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was so funny, it was so funny. And there's a very important quote in at the start of the book, which is from Julian Barrett of The Mighty Boosh, saying to really take the piss out of something, you have to love it. And so very key to it all is that, like the erotic poetry, I'm laughing at my mother's erotic poetry, but that doesn't mean that all I'm doing is making fun of it, because I kind of think it's amazing. It's kind of brilliant. It's partly brilliant because she doesn't know what a poem is, and that's what makes it brilliant. And something I particularly zoom in on, which she doesn't know what inverted commas are, right? And so there's this thing that she does where most people would be using inverted commas to mean, oh, this is a bit naughty, she gets it wrong, and she uses them over, for example, the phrase "nibble my clitoris," which is about as far away from you. It's the opposite. It's actually the opposite of a euphemism.
My toes just curled in my shoes.
Yeah, but it's magnificent, I think, at some level.
Yeah.
I think I use it because I think it's funny, but I also, again, and the book is more like this than the show, because I got time to do it, I sort of, and I don't mean this insincerely, I'd compare it at one point to Wallace Stevens doing that poem about I ate the plums in the icebox, they were so sweet and cold, sorry I ate them. And I know what Wallace Stevens is doing there, which my mum isn't doing consciously. Wallace Stevens is saying, in the same way that Marcel Duchamp is saying this urinal is a work of art, he's saying this note on a fridge is a work of poetry, and it could be, right? Now, when my mum is writing about her sex life or writing about meeting a golfing guy, she does a whole thing about wanting to meet a golf person at the BBC, she says, but you weren't there, and then she starts yearning for David White. It's unbelievably mundane, but she's trying to poeticise the mundane, but not like Wallace Stevens is with a self-conscious modernist hat on. She's just doing it.
Do you think there's anything in here for the average person who, struggling with their relationships to their own family members, can perhaps maybe take a different perspective, that the weirder our families are, the more they're deserving of our understanding? You did it perhaps from maybe a more natural position, if that's how you interrogate the world generally. But do you think that this could help people forgive their own family members?
I hope so. I mean, it's interesting because I used the example earlier of Spare and how that's a very unforgiving book. And then you said, would this make us a sort of normal person? Obviously, he's not a normal person. Having said that, I think, one of the things I know about writing this book and about having done a show using the same subject is that sometimes people would say to me, sometimes they will say to me, someone said this morning, oh, it really reminded me of my family, right? And of course, there's no point in saying, oh, what, your mum had an affair with a golfing memorabilia specialist and then turned out you're like, no. What they mean is, I came from a background that was kind of idiosyncratic and weird, and that I probably normalised when I was young, and now when I look back on it, I think, God, that's fucking weird, because that's what families do. Families are... Frank Skinner once said this thing, which is very dark, but I think it's true, which he said when he worked in a factory, there was a bloke who told him that he so couldn't bear the way that his wife ate cornflakes, that he would eat his breakfast with a pair of massive headphones on stuffed with tissues. And that would have become normalised, right? And the reason it's dark is, Frank said, I remember, that down the line, that leads to Fred and Rose West. Now, that's the dark bit. And what it means is that real weird, terrible behaviour doesn't start with the weird, terrible behaviour. It often starts with something that's just a bit out of the ordinary, and then something more out of the ordinary, and then something awful can happen, or just mad and funny stuff can happen at the other end of the line. But I think that everyone, that's what families are. Families are self-enclosed units in which most of the time strange things happen. And then what happens is, which I think is a tragedy, is that after people are dead, or after the family's dissolved, or whatever it might be, is that people are so frightened of the fear of being seen to wash their dirty linen in public, or whatever it might be, that they create a propaganda of what their families were that is not the truth, and which does a disservice. It does a disservice to truth, a disservice to memory, and indeed a disservice to the people who you're saying, oh, they were wonderful to, because, as I said earlier, you're blanding them out. The dead, as I say in the book, the dead, despite what we might like to think, are not angels.
Your mother passed away in 2015, is that right?
Well, actually, the end of 2014, but she was buried at the start of 2015. Cremated, in fact.
And has this book been, as many memoirs are, an attempt to purge?
No.
This isn't about getting rid of anything,
No, it's about feeling that thing, that her, both in her bodily self and in who she actually was, i.e. the memory of her, and in all her complexity. And the same with my dad. Was being very quickly lost as soon as she was dead, through the mistaken idea that flattering the dead is the way to be nice about them. And I'm so obsessed with truth, and I'm particularly obsessed, I guess, with truth about my own life, that I felt a very strong urge to I mean, it comes back to your first question. You remember your first question is, you're someone who, when you say something, you then need to qualify it and then, perhaps contradict it or whatever in an effort to tell as much truth as possible. That's the basic urge, because there is, if you see that same thing as people saying to me at my mother's funeral, oh, she was wonderful, and me saying no, or wanting to say no, or she certainly wasn't wonderful like you mean it, let me explain, and it's going to take a long time. And it's going to be a lot of specifics, and it's going to be very complicated. That's how you tell the truth, in my mind. And once you tell the truth, it's an act of reclamation. And I think someone did ask me this morning as well. They really, really fucking love the book. About how will you write a second one? Will you write another book? I said no. I think I've done it now. I'd like to just show about it. I mean, there is interest in doing a TV drama, which I don't think I would write. But it may have another incarnation yet. But I don't want to write a volume 2 because I think, I have now revisited this subject, and psychologically, in terms of what your question is, I think I am satiated.
David Baddiel, thank you very much for coming to meet me here at DARS, and I'm going to continue to read My Family, the memoir, with great interest. Thank you very much.